Okay, everyone, welcome to our week 5 topic of climate change as we delve even further into some of the key problems affecting our world and international relations theory and practice. So this is our last topic before the Easter break, and then we'll come back and do our final topic on pandemics. So we're really ratcheting up the urgency of the issues that we're looking at. And I hope that you'll get something out of this lecture today, as well as the workshops that we have coming up next week. Now, before I start, I just wanted to make a note about the MCQs. So, I mean, just a general reminder to please do them before the deadline. But some of you may have noticed as well that once you've finished your MCQ quizzes, you should still be getting a grade, but you won't be getting told immediately which questions you got wrong and which were the right options for those particular questions. And that's just because I've just been advised by the assessments team that I have to ensure that that feedback isn't given to you prior to the closing of the quiz itself. And this is because it's a policy of Monash for that to occur, so that there's not the possibility of students, completing the quiz, seeing what they got wrong, and then telling one of their friends what the right answer was. This isn't a concern for this class, of course, and certainly not something I was thinking or worrying about, but it's unfortunately something the assessment team has noticed. So I've had to just change that. But then hopefully once the quiz is done, you should be able to then go back to it and see, when the timing of that quiz is done, you can go back to it and see, hopefully then what questions you got correct and what were the, ones that you got wrong and the correct options. So if that doesn't work for anyone, just let me know, but that should hopefully be how the quizzes will go ahead. So apologies about, again, another slight change with the quiz, but hopefully it's not affecting your completion of it terribly. So now let's get into this week's topic of climate change, if I can progress my slides. There we go. So this week we're going to understand the relevance of climate change to international relations firstly, because I think international relations really was quite a slow uptake of the climate crisis as an issue in IR. So we're going to look at how climate change is relevant to international relations, and indeed climate change, or what we might call global warming, has become central to a lot of critical IR. It's still arguably on the margins of some realist and liberal thought, but we will be exploring those frameworks to understand the climate change crisis. This time, I guess this week, these frameworks will be wrapped up in the exploration of the issue itself rather than have a distinctive section at the end. And I'll talk us through that as we go through. One of the things that I really want to do as well is kind of go a bit deep into the terminology that's used in the climate change debate, which is central to it, especially that in the critical scholarship. So you would have probably seen terms like Anthropocene, maybe even Capitalocene. We're going to be looking at those terms critically, what they mean, what they leave out, and what they provide to international relations theorizing. So this is kind of the general learning objectives, and just a note about the required readings. Again, important for you to do them for our in-class discussion as well as the MCQ quizzes too. So I've picked 2 here, which I hope this will be interesting because it kind of shows a really nice debate between a more liberal perspective, which is that by Burke and colleagues, and then a more critical perspective by Chandler and colleagues. And you may notice Chandler was one of the authors of one of the readings. I can't remember if it was recommended or required for the state building and conflict. So Chandler gets around and writes some really good pieces in critical IR generally, but you'll see that this is quite a nice debate between the two, and you'll hopefully be able to pick up more clearly some of the ontological and epistemological reference frames and how that changes not only the understanding of this particular issue, but also the potential political and international relations solutions that then flow from that analysis. So firstly, we'll start with what is the climate crisis. And I want to give here a little bit of an overview of what it is, and then how it became important for international relations theories, go through some terminology around like climate change or global warming, and then have a bit more of an extended discussion around differentiating the Anthropocene from the Capitalocene, because this goes into the importance of our theoretical frameworks and understanding this issue, because it's not just a matter of terminology, but a lot of theorizing goes at the behind these terms. And so I'm going to go into some detail about them as well. But firstly, we'll just kind of go through what exactly is the climate crisis. And I think many of you will be aware of this, but just for completion, I just want to outline some of the important points and facts that have come to light, especially more recently in international relations scholarship. So I think many of you would have heard about the increasing concentrations now in the atmosphere of carbon dioxide, which has now exceeded, as of this year, that experience for over the last million years, or as long as records have been kept. And global greenhouse emissions trends show that the planet is kind of going towards a world in this century that may be 3 to 5 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial era. This could then mean a world of like melted ice caps, permafrost flooded cities, acidic oceans that they can't even support life, and the loss of rainforest ecosystems like in the Amazon. Ocean acidification, pollution, and overfishing may also cause the collapse of all major marine fisheries by mid-century. And we've already seen, hundreds of species become extinct since about the 1500s. And half of the world's wild animals have also disappeared in the last 4 decades too. And all this is also looming as many parts of the world are suffering under even more extreme poverty and inequality, which has really ramped up since the 1970s. And communities from like the Niger Delta to Bangladesh are condemned to live in these kind of sacrifice zones, which are devastated by oil drilling, mining, pollution, fracking, nuclear testing, and other inundations. So we've got this kind of situation now where we have these processes of climate change kind of meeting the political and economic crises that have been supercharging since the 1970s. And because of this, climate change has moved from the margins to the center of international politics, as well as international relations theory and practice. So it used to just be one among kind of many issues or fields that were aside things like poverty reduction, health, trade, and so forth. But now it's becoming like a whole master framework that will shape foreign policy and relations between states on a par with security and economic interests, which have always been the major focus of the mainstream international relations school of thought. There is still obviously uncertainty exactly about what the future climate might look like, as well as the policy responses to that. But scholars of international relations and politics, which we are, need to better reflect on climate change within existing frameworks, and also through like creating new ones with climate change as a central reference point. Interestingly enough, I saw some data this week which demonstrated that a survey of 5 major international relations journals demonstrated that climate change, even quite recently, has not really been on the radar. So between 2015 and 2019, only 0.76% of the articles in these 5 major international relations journals were about climate change or some kind of related topic. So it still seems like there's some ignoring of climate change by international relations scholars, and this really runs a risk of us collectively not being able to understand and explain what will be possibly a defining aspect of global affairs in the coming decades. And I think in the worst case, the indifference of the mainstream IR, especially towards climate change, could be interpreted as ignorance or even a form of implicit climate skepticism around this issue. And what has been assumed as like fixed reference points for international affairs will, with climate change, even radically change, or even might dissipate. So territories might disappear, countries might become uninhabitable, which all of this would alter the state security really radically, which is again has been a central tenet of international relations theorizing. The value of inhabitable territory, which might would be above sea level, without extreme weather, but with access to fresh water and food, may rise. So then the stakes involved in geopolitics would increase, as well as in geoengineering, with the prospects of this kind of zero-sum logics where states seek to safeguard their own territories, food production, and citizens with this like increasing climate crisis. So the value of what today drives the world economy, non-renewable energy primarily, will decrease, which then might even leave many like stranded geopolitical assets. So there's all this kind of uncertainty and economic and political interrelations around climate change, which are even goes to the real central points of mainstream IR theory. And I think, a lot of looking at a lot of international relations scholars has generally demonstrated that, a lot of research has only fitfully or partially incorporated the most up-to-date kind of understandings of climate change into their analysis. And for me, going through some of the literature on this, there's maybe three kind of different ways that most mainstream IR scholars think about climate change. This is again thinking about our liberal, realist, and even constructivist frameworks as our mainstream scholars. So the first one is usually that climate change is seen like a threat multiplier. And this is most familiar with like, the US Department of Defense and other similar agencies that focus on how climate change increases the probability of civil wars, forced migration, political violence, and infrastructure damage. Okay. And then the second is these kind of like issue trade-offs, which imagines climate change as an issue area and one that kind of creates instrumental trade-offs with other military and economic priorities. And so this is an example of this was when the Obama administration in 2014 reportedly delayed a freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea in exchange for Chinese support for the Paris Agreement. So again, you can see quite nicely as well how climate change and the issues around climate change can also impact regional security, part of which we explored last week. And now the third is kind of way of thinking about climate change in IR, or mainstream IR, is this altered landscape. So it sees climate change not as an issue area at all, really, but as a pervasive background condition that is intrinsically connected to most other areas of interstate competition and cooperation. So it's kind of integrated already into some of these frameworks. So we'll touch on these mainstream views of IR and global warming throughout the rest of this lecture, but we'll predominantly be concerned with more critical analysis of this vital issue, as I think it provides a more generally, across all the critical schools we'll be going into, more in-depth, often comprehensive and scholarly understanding of the climate crisis, which also seeks to integrate some of that up-to-date natural sciences research on it as well. So let's just firstly touch on climate change versus global warming. So these terms are thrown around and often used quite interchangeably, and I think during this lecture I'll also be using them interchangeably as well. But there has been controversy around the use of whether what we're seeing is climate change or global warming. So generally, climate change refers to this kind of large-scale, long-term shift in the planet's weather patterns and average temperatures. And climate change is seen as the result of global warming, where global warming is like a more, I guess, a smaller process under this climate change umbrella, where global warming refers to how much the Earth's surface temperature is rising. And it is the effect of this warming on average weather conditions that then produces what we call climate change. So the I guess global warming is kind of more localized. Climate change is often used as a broader description. So when we have broader climate change on a global scale, then we have alterations in established patterns of weather, for example, which might lead to consequences like more frequent droughts and heat waves, more devastating hurricanes, more intense rainfall, and so on, which isn't captured purely by the term of global warming. So apart from causing potentially more extreme weather events, climate change can also alter the timing of the seasons, which disrupt the lives of plant and animals, for example. And this is highly anecdotal, but I've felt like in this summer that we've had has been stretching on for a really long time, and we're like end of March now, and only had a 35-degree day the other day, and I've felt it's been really, really dry, and my plants at home, inside and outside, have just been struggling. Like it has been an uphill battle to keep them alive, which I've often been failing. So this is very anecdotal, but even this summer, I've felt very different from the last in recent memory in terms of how hard I've had to work to keep my plants alive. So anyway, global warming is kind of seen as this like subgenre or sub-branch of broader climate change, and maybe a more short-term description of what is happening in our climate, while climate change is a more long-term description. And so I will be using them kind of interchangeably in a way, and especially when referring to the short term and long term. But I mean, I just wanted to kind of note that there are some critical voices out there who have argued that climate change is deployed because it sounds a little bit more ambiguous as to what that change might mean, because like, you can change for the good, obviously, and it doesn't really describe exactly what is happening. Whereas sometimes critical voices say global warming is a lot clearer as to the pattern that's occurring, that it's warming, right? But I just wanted to flag these and note that I'll be using both more or less interchangeably. Now, the Anthropocene versus Capitalocene, again, two different terms, but is a much more complex and quite long discussion that I want to go into about these two, because it integrates not only our critical theories, and firstly contrasts them with mainstream IR theories, but also goes into more detail about ontologies and epistemologies to understand whether we're in an Anthropocene or a Capitalocene. So I'm going to go into these terms in some detail here, and I'll progress the slides as we go, and I'll introduce some points in more detail. So this will be a more in-depth discussion, which I want you to take away not just the difference in like terminology, but also kind of the theories behind them. So the first thing just to state is that the Anthropocene has really been the most popularly used term, I think, to describe what we're in at the moment. And it kind of represents an unprecedented change in the continued livability of planet Earth, caused by the rapacious use of natural resources with no thought for current and especially future generations of humans, as well as the other millions of species affected by changing climatic conditions and ecosystem damage. So this term Anthropocene was formulated by a couple of authors in the early 2000s, Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stoermer. And the Anthropocene concept proceeds from an eminently kind of reasonable position where the biosphere and geological time has been fundamentally transformed by human activity. Okay, that's kind of the baseline understanding of what the Anthropocene is. And it includes this kind of new conceptualization of geological time over history as one that includes mankind as a major geological force. And at the time, when this was proposed, especially in the early 2000s, this was a very courageous proposal because to propose, humanity as a geological agent is to actually transgress some of modernity's fundamental kind of intellectual boundaries around, human and nature as two distinct entities. So demonstrating humanity as an agent within nature kind of goes past that dichotomization. And this is something we'll come back to quite frequently. And at its best, the Anthropocene concept entwines human history and natural history together, even if it doesn't quite have or contain a story about the why is there a climate crisis, and how, do we have it, remains kind of unclear and also very hotly debated. So I think from the outset, before we talk more about the capitalist scene, we have to be quite clear about the kind of two lives that exist in the Anthropocene. So one is that the Anthropocene is a broader conversation that transcends like the scholarly background from whence it came, so transcends the university. And the Anthropocene has opened some measure of public space for dialogue around humanity's place in the web of life, we might say, or in the social totality. So, if you've read this or seen it, you probably would have seen like the Anthropocene, maybe. I think it's been included in like, Times Magazine, in The Economist, in really major publications. So the Anthropocene is something that has really opened up discourse around climate change and the humanity's place in it. So it engages these really big questions of historical change. So how do humans make nature? How do natures make humans? And how does that relation kind of shape the long run of human history? Now, these are questions that the Anthropocene can pose, but I want to argue with you today that they can't really answer. And it's because this Anthropocene perspective retains, even as it kind of tries to transcend, the binary of humanity and nature. So the dominant Anthropocene argument assumes a very standard narrative. It says that the origins of the modern world are to be found in England right around the dawn of the 19th century, where the motivating force behind this epochal shift is coal and steam. And the driving force behind this coal and steam, occurring at this time is just humanity as an undifferentiated whole. So, humanity produced this coal and steam, or, modernized through coal and steam at this point in time, but there's no kind of account of, class, not capital, not imperialism, not culture, nothing else kind of behind that. So this is something we're going to come back to and critique and look at the history of, the human interaction with the climate in a different way shortly. So this Anthropocene, where this coal and steam kind of just appear in the 19th century in England, is quite an easy and relatively simple story. It doesn't really challenge the naturalized inequalities, alienation, and violence, which was inscribed in modernity's strategic relations of power and production at this time and since. It's also an easy story to tell because it doesn't really ask us to think about the relations between humans and ourselves and humans and nature. It reduces all of human activity in the world to an abstract kind of homogeneous humanity. Again, it removes inequality, commodification, imperialism, patriarchy, and a lot from humanity's position within nature. Sometimes theorists who think the Anthropocene acknowledge these things, but just that they kind of exist as kind of an after the fact supplement. So these kind of initial opening salvos I wanted to point out will color our subsequent discussions about, well, how can we move past those limitations of the Anthropocene? So just have a drink. So the Anthropocene argument takes like kind of biological and geological questions and facts as kind of an adequate basis for historical periodization. So there's kind of two subtle but quite powerful methodological decisions within the research of people who think the Anthropocene that underpin their approach, which I wanted to highlight. And again, this kind of expands a little bit on what I've just noted previously in the previous slide. So in the first instance, the empirical focus is narrowed to the consequences of human activity. So the Anthropocene concept makes the case for humanity's domination of the Earth almost entirely through a significant catalogue of biospheric changes. And these the drivers of such changes are usually reduced to very black box descriptive categories like industrialization, urbanization, population, and so on and so forth. And then the second methodological choice that underpins a lot of this research turns on the construction of humanity as a collective actor, which I emphasized a little bit before. And like I mentioned, this choice erases the historical and geographical patterns of differentiation and coherence in the idea of kind of this narrative simplicity. And this erasure of this differentiation and even, you might say, like the elevation of the anthropos or the human as a collective actor has encouraged a lot of kind of different misrecognitions. So firstly, a neo-Malthusian view of population. So for those who aren't aware of Malthusian's or Malthus's work a few hundred years ago, this basically is centered around a concern of growing population, that, more population grows, the more this like climate threat will occur. And, Malthus was originally theorizing in terms of increasing population and problems around agricultural production and not being able to feed enough people. So a neo-Malthusian view of the population has continued anxieties about population growth. And it's usually centered, again, around population growth around the global south, quite typically. But one of these things is that it ignores the modern world system's kind of actually existing patterns of family formation and population movement, which has, is more nuanced and has more localized and regional impacts on climate. Looking at humanity as a collective actor also has a view of historical change dominated by kind of technology resource complexes, like seeing the beginning of the Anthropocene as the emergence of coal as resource and steam as technology, and focusing on then other subsequent complexes like oil and its extraction, for example, to as a progress of history. And as well, when we homogenize humanity, we see a concept of scarcity or concern about lack of food, lack of area, lack of other things for our population, which is abstracted from relations of capital, class, and empire. And it also assigns responsibility for global change to humanity as a whole, rather than to the man-made forces of capital and empire that has given modern world history its coherence. So the dominant Anthropocene argument therefore kind of poses a question that it cannot answer, which is, how have humans become a geological force? Weren't we a geological force previously, through the thousands of years of humanity's existence? So again, these kind of critiques I want you to think about, especially when you're reading stuff around the Anthropocene, like what kind of answers and what kind of questions does the Anthropocene really help us with in terms of climate change? And so I want to go now into a little bit more as to the Capitalocene, which you may have seen in the reading this week. This book I have here, I think, Moore's book. I don't know if you can see this. Moore's book, you probably can't see that very well, sorry, but it says Anthropocene or Capitalocene. So this is one of the kind of recommended readings. And I think I said that just chapter 1 of that, but a lot of the book is really interesting, especially Moore's later chapter as well. And it goes more into this debate, and I'm kind of hopefully giving you a bit of a flavor of it, because, I also want to emphasize too, this is just not me going into some deep dive of some nuance, not important, like technical distinction between terms. The Anthropocene versus Capitalocene question is really like a huge driving force of current scholarly debate in the international relations literature, in political theory literature, and across the scholarship. And hopefully you'll see that kind of playing out a little bit in the required readings, although oh no, they definitely use these terms, but it's certainly developed since that time. So I want to kind of hopefully give you the foundations of understanding this debate, and then you can again either challenge your own concepts of your own international relations theory, construct new ideas about international relations from this discussion is my main goal. Now, the capitalist scene. The capitalist scene, even though what it sounds like, it doesn't stand for capitalism as an economic and social system purely per se. Rather, this term, the capitalist scene, signifies capitalism as a way of organizing nature. So as a multi-species situated capitalist world ecology. The idea is that it captures a basic historical pattern of world history, which we might even call the age of capital, and the era of capitalism as a world ecology of power, capital, and nature. So it's not about replacing one word with another, but the capitalist scene argument says three things that the Anthropocene perspective does not and really cannot. So first, it insists that the history of capitalism is a relation of capital, power, and nature as an organic whole. So it's said to be world ecological, and it's a multi-species affair. And it's a historically situated complex of power and capital assemblages throughout the world, which has changed over time. And in that way, secondly, the history of capitalism cannot just be reduced to the burning of fossil fuels in England or anywhere else. It is a history of the relations of power and production as well as reproduction, which is premised on what critical scholars have called the cash nexus. So premised on making money, basically. So these relations enfolded coal and other energy sources from the 16th century. They allowed for successive waves of global conquest and worldwide appropriations of cheap nature. And we'll go into that history in a little bit more detail soon. And thirdly, the capitalist scene argument challenges the more Eurocentric and frankly false view of capitalism as purely emerging in England during the 18th to 19th century. So this perspective of the capitalist scene, as we'll see as I go into a little bit more detail about exactly what it is, can be quite challenging because it's not thinking about capitalism simply as a matter of economics, like markets, prices, money, and all that. So instead of thinking about capitalism as simply economics, we ask if capitalism is about something much more profound. So we then instead start to think about capitalism as a way of organizing nature, which is therefore a new way of organizing the relations between work, reproduction, and the conditions of surrounding life. So markets, prices, and money are still very important in this framework, but it helps us think about how every market, every price, every movement, and the accumulation of money was bundled with extra human nature and human work too, even if much of it was unpaid. So the idea is it's a broader heuristic or a broader device in thinking about the rise of capital as not simply just an economic system per se. So let's go into a little bit more about then how does the capitalist scene think about history, which is different to the Anthropocene. So then when we start thinking about capitalist scene as a world ecological system, and this again is suggested by Moore, who really probably is one of the more, I think, early and foremost scholars around the capitalist scene concept, and I do really encourage you to read some of that book that I linked, and Moore's other papers are really good on this point as well. So from the idea of capitalist scene as a world ecological perspective, there's three really important intertwined historical perspectives that then come from that. The first one is called primitive accumulation, and this is something that Karl Marx first noted in his famous book Kapital, which entailed kind of a range of processes that made humans dependent on on basically getting money for their survival, right? So this particular stage of history has been called by social sciences as proletarization. So this is where people changed their social status and I guess the way that they lived from initially like relying on the land that they had, the relations they had with community to produce things for their survival, to then selling their labor for money. Okay, and this is what proletarianization is. So to become a proletariat is someone who needs to sell their labor for money, which we basically all are still today, right? So this early stage of this movement of proletarianization was about the transformation of human activity into labor power, but that could be then exchanged on the commodity system, which is sometimes called the labor market, which again, terms we still use today. Even if you think about this particular human activity of selling your labor for money as somehow independent of nature, there is no avoiding of one particular fact about this historical process, that proletarianization was rooted in the governance of nature and the replacement of custom and commons, that people had things and land and crops and animals and whatever in common, by the dominance of commodities. So sometimes peasants, for example, were forced off the land during this process of primitive accumulation. So as the feudal system was ending, peasants would often have their land seized by new wealthy elites, through various mechanisms. And this primitive accumulation of land, and it's primitive because it usually involved violence, forced peasants off their land, and they found their way to the towns. While some, for instance, may have been dispossessed but kept on their land, but they were reduced to living in small cottages and forced into agricultural work on their previous holdings. So the new bourgeois, or the new rich or the new elite at that time, would seize these farms or take them over through various means, and then those peasants would either go to town and become proletarians, where they'd sell their labor to the increasing, industrial manufacturers at that time, or they would stay in the local region and sell their labor back to the people who had evicted them from their land. So sometimes even like a kind of third possibility in proletarianization phase is that sometimes these proletarians did not really like appear proletarian at all. And I think the main kind of example of this is like African slave labor in Brazilian and Caribbean sugar plantations was a really good example of this. So these people obviously ripped from their land through, again, primitive accumulation of their land by colonial powers, but they didn't either stay around to be re-employed on those lands. They didn't go into the local towns and then sell their labor, but they were seized to become slaves in other parts of the world. So these slaves, similar to workers in 17th century England, or even in the New America colonial parts of the world, slaves also depended upon the cash nexus to survive as well. So this commodification and the reliance on money to survive also very much affected slavery as well, because as a slave, if you weren't producing things for the slave owner and therefore making them money, then that would of course affect your survival. So this process of proletarianization was never just principally economic. It wasn't just an economic concern for the rich at that time to get more money. And it was about new forms of territorial power that emerged after 1450. And this is kind of our second process, this proletarianization, which goes hand in hand with this new territorial power. So the old territorial power at that time, which is the overlapping jurisdictions and personalized authority of medieval Europe, so this is before 1450, had crumbled in the long-running feudal crisis of the time, which lasted from about the early 1300s to around 1450 itself. So West Central Europe's ruling classes had tried to restore feudal labor systems and they'd failed. The most dynamic of the new states that had started to emerge owed their alliance with merchant capitalists who were far more than just merchants. And this was the alliance of the Iberian crowns like in Spain with the Genoese capitalists like in Italy, which quite literally made the space that allowed capitalism to emerge. So these new empires that started to form were made possible by this power of a new type. And at its core was the generalization of private property. So for a new practice of modern private property emerged in these centuries. And its strategic goal really was, again, this separation of the peasantry from their access to land. So the arable and grazing land, the forests, the wetlands, which are often held in common through peasants in an area. They could all go into, they could collect sticks, they could grow things, they could, have husbandry and all kinds of things. This closure of those common areas and the privatization of that property was the fundamental condition of this proletarianization, which we've spoken about. And like proletarianization, these enclosures and dispossessions were really, varied at the time. But this was kind of a broad process which was occurring. So we had this primitive accumulation and proletarianization, which were interlinked and occurring at roughly around the same time in the century after the 1450s. Now, our third great historical process turned on kind of new ways of how to know the world. These were not just kind of purely symbolic like thinking of the world, but actually had really material consequences. So the ongoing condition of turning human activity into labor power and land into property was premised really on a symbolic knowledge regime, which is premised on separation, okay, on alienation, which is what critical scholars have called it. So this we can think of this separation of this new knowledge as a series of kind of scientific revolutions in the broader sense of the term at the time. So this regime, again, which you can recognize today of separating things like, humans, nature, man, woman, this kind of thinking made it possible to launch and sustain a process that threatens us all today, really, which is putting the whole work of nature as a separate category to work for capital or the economy, which is another totally separate category. And the job of science at that time was to make nature legible to capital accumulation. So this meant transforming it into units of nature that was counterpoised to capital and empire. And the job of the economy was to channel this alienation through this cash nexus. So basically changing nature, which was a separate thing, into money. And the job of the state was to enforce this possibility. So obviously, for us as scholars in international relations, we know that this separation from nature was really illusory, or totally not real, right? Because we can't ever escape nature. But it's the terms of how humanity relate to nature did change. And these changing terms of humanity on one side and nature on the other, which was a very complex and protracted process, caused very material consequences. It caused this kind of world practice of remaking the world in the image of capital. So this mode of distinction that presumed separation that we see in humanity and nature not only had impacts on what we might consider now as nature, but this separation also had implications for broader humanity. So where some people became human, and these were members of another something called civilization or society, which people like Adam Smith in the 1700s called civilized society. But from the beginning of capitalism, around this 1450s, most humans in the world were actually excluded from humanity. So, indigenous Australians would be a very good example of this, or indigenous Americans, or slaves, for instance, as well. Or they were designated as only partly human, which was virtually all European women at that time. So as with property, the symbolic boundaries between like who was and who was not part of nature or society tended to shift and vary. They were often blurry, often quite flexible, but there was a boundary there. And much of the early history of modern race and gender struggles actually around that particular line of who is what in this distinction. So the boundary between nature and society is a really, really important one. And it's something that's often, it's recognized by the Anthropocene. And like I mentioned before, it's really affirmed in that particular concept. And the capital scene demonstrates how that nature-society divide was fundamental to the rise of capitalism, because it allowed nature to become nature as an environment without humans. Okay, or nature was full of humans who were treated as nature, as not humans, right? And so this meant that the world could be reduced to a series of external objects. Nature could be mapped, it could be explored, it could be surveyed, it could be calculated to discover what nature could do for the accumulation of capital. And the substance of that value was human labor productivity. So what could human labor do to nature to render it sellable, right? To make it a commodity that we could sell, that we could get money. So this idea of human work was homogenized. That it was measured without regard to cultural, biophysical, cooperative dimensions. There was just units of labor acting on nature to create money. It was, human activity was abstracted, averaged, deprived of all meaning except for one, which is value as the average labor time making the average commodity. And this is actually, this central aspect is really what Marx's research in capitalism in his time was all about, which is understanding how that value of labor time was calculated in making an average commodity, right? That's really the essence of his manuscript Capital. Now, in highlighting these Cartesian dualities as a key source of the problem, which, as I mentioned before, is kind of unconsciously embraced by this Anthropocene argument, we're seeking to kind of make sense of three great thought procedures that have shaped the modern world. So the first one is this imposition of an ontological status upon entities as opposed to relationships, right? So, and this goes back to our ontology of thinking about what is there in the world. So if you have an ontological or an imposition of an ontological status upon entities or upon things, then when we look at the world, we see like substances, we see materials, we see individual bodies, right? And just separate categories of things, which again, from week one, you guys might remember refers to like liberal thought. There's these individual ontologically distinct things as substances, as opposed to relationships, which again, we've discussed as might be like energy, flowing between things, the people and the relations between them, ideas and so on, right? And this distinction as well, this Cartesian dualities has a centrality of a logic of either or, rather than both and. So you're either in this category or either in that category. There's no overlap between the two. And particularly what then emerged, this third thing, is the idea of a way to purposively control nature through science, which has been a really key part of this story of the growth of capitalism. So, as I mentioned before, most humans around this time were in the category of nature rather than humanity. And this enabled a very, like to put it bluntly, an audacious act of global bookkeeping. So, on the one hand, the decisive thing was work was reproduced, directly or indirectly through money. So you paid people to do labor, make things, and you kept reproducing their ability to do that by paying them so they could buy groceries to feed themselves, their families, and keep living. And this included a great deal more people in early modern capitalism than scholars usually acknowledge, right? There's a lot of people doing that work. But on the other hand, the volume of work reproduced through this cash nexus depended upon a much greater volume of work outside things that were paid as work, right? But were within the reach of capitalist power. So this includes things like the free labor of women, obviously not paid for, but incredibly important to the reproduction of the working force. Also nature, which is seen as free or cheap and things that could just be extracted and taken, and as well as the colonies. So, capitalist power, of course, instituted domination of the colonies and ensured that that labor was free. So the appropriation of women, nature, and colonies, and this is a point which is really focused on by a lot of feminist work looking into climate change, is the fundamental condition of the exploitation of labor power in the commodity system. So capitalism in its early form, and arguably still today, could not exist as it is, which is fundamentally around people making stuff to sell, to put it very simply, without the free labor of women, as slaves or otherwise indentured people around the world, as well as cheap or free nature. So this is the disproportionality which feminist work often emphasize between paid work, reproduced through this cash nexus, or whenever I say cash nexus, it basically means you're paying for stuff. So you have this paid work, and then on the other hand, you have unpaid work, which is reproduced outside this circuit of capital, but absolutely indispensable to its expanded reproduction. Every act of producing value then depends upon a disproportionately greater act of appropriating unpaid work of humans and extra-human nature. And because capitalism is a system that is driven by competition in the productive space, which means more productivity, more hour of necessary labor time, it must appropriate ever larger spheres of uncapitalized nature. Now, this whole system works, as ecological economists have long underscored, because capital pays for only one set of costs and works strenuously to keep all other costs kind of off the books, which, these are costs of reproducing labor power, food, energy, and raw materials. So this separation, again, performed a really special kind of work for the modern world. Backed by imperial power and capitalist rationality, it mobilized the unpaid work and energy of humans, and especially women, and especially the enslaved, in servicing to transform landscapes with a singular purpose, which was the endless accumulation of capital. So even, again, to go back to the Anthropocene, we can see this Cartesian dualism, even though they identify that there was a separation there, but Anthropocene theorists still rely on this duality to kind of understand the world. And it really leads Anthropocene advocates to construct the historical period 1800 on an arithmetic basis, where it's like human activity plus biospheric changes equals the Anthropocene. But it obscures the actually existing relations through which women and men have made history within the global sphere, or this kind of totality of life. which we'll go into again in a little bit more detail soon. So this duality between nature, humans, between women, men, between other dualities that have been drawn, is not just a problem because it's philosophically problematic, and that it's just thinking about two things separately when they're obviously interconnected, but it's because it's practically bound up with the way of thinking about the world, which again is ontologically what is out there, and epistemologically how do we know what's out there, which took shape between the 15th and 18th centuries. So technology then works through this disproportionality. It works not only to advance labor productivity, but to appropriate a rising physical mass of unpaid work and energy from manifold natures. We see this particularly at work in the long history of capitalist mechanization. So 16th century sugar mills, 18th century steam engines, the Ford assembly line, all of these were premised at every turn on the appropriation of cheap natures. The plantation system was built on cheap land and labor. Steam engines developed at the pitheads of coal mines. The Ford assembly lines were worthless without cheap oil, steel, and coal. And this bonanza of cheap fossil fuels allowed capital to smooth out its greatest problem before 1830, which was the recurrent underproduction of food, energy, and raw materials, which was owing to advancing labor productivity in the industrial centers. Now, since the 1970s, the possibilities for securing cheap nature have narrowed significantly. This kind of progressive closure of capitalism's kind of cheap nature frontiers as capitalism has spread to every corner of the world has set in motion a new tendency, which is widely discussed in terms of neoliberalism, which is this reassertion of market rule with this lack of ability for capital to go to non-capital spaces, and sharply kind of rising inequality between rich and poor. So we've seen now more recently an exhaustion of a centuries-long model of appropriating unpaid work and energy outside the cash nexus, outside of actually producing commodities and selling them. And capitalism metabolism of this work and energy and labor is crucial because it sharpens our focus on how human work unfolds through its relation to planetary life. And the genius of capitalism has been to find ways through culture, science, the state, to appropriate these streams of work for free or low cost. And we find that these great economic revolutions, which have propelled labor productivity within the commodity sphere, are always accompanied by either new sciences, new forms of state power, or new imperialisms. So this is kind of the line in the sand between the Anthropocene and Capitalocene arguments. And I realize this distinction between the two has gone on for quite some time. And I'm going to stretch it out just for a little bit more to now go through explicitly the Capitalocene understanding of that history to demonstrate the differences here. Because if we take the centrality of work and human work as central to our thinking about capitalism, which is, ontologically how we define it, how do we define capitalism, which is through work, and epistemologically, how do we know about it, and its history, right, through our position as workers as well, is obviously very helpful. We get to see a relational view of work, power, and reproduction and production since the mid-1400s. So from this angle of vision, from this particular lens that we can put on, a very different perspective of the Anthropocene problem comes into focus. So how the origins of a new pattern of environment making began in the Atlantic world during what Brunel has called the long 16th century. And the difference speaks to divergent historical interpretations, which will then have impacts for political strategies and international relations theorizing. So to locate modernity's origins through the steam engine and the coal pit, as the Anthropocene does, is to prioritize shutting down the steam engines and the coal pits, and as well as the 21st incarnations. But to locate the origins of the modern world with the rise of capitalism after 1450, with its audacious strategies of global conquest, endless commodification, relentless rationalization, is to prioritize a much different politics and much different solutions in international relations. And this pursues the fundamental transformation of the relations of power, knowledge, and capital that have made the modern world. But, by shutting down a coal plant, you can slow global warming for a day. But if you shut down the relations that make the coal plant, you can stop it for good. So then how does capital scene understand the problem of global warming? And this now goes into our historical understanding. So using that historical epistemological framework. And the rise of capitalism after 1450 marked a turning point in the history of humanity's relation with the rest of nature. It was greater than any other watershed since the rise of agriculture and the first cities. And in relational terms, it was even greater than the rise of the steam engine. After this period of time in 1450, there was an epochal shift in the scale, the speed, and the scope of landscape transformation across the geographical expanse of early capitalism. So the long kind of 17th century forest clearances, particularly in Brazil, the Vistula Basin occurred on a scale and at a speed between 5 and 10 times greater than anything seen in medieval Europe. Feudal Europe had taken centuries to deforest large expanses of Western and Central Europe, but after 1450, comparable deforestation occurred in decades, not centuries. One example which I saw was in medieval Picardy, which is in northeastern France. It took 200 years to clear 12,000 hectares of forest, which began in the 12th century. But then 4 centuries later, in northeastern Brazil, with the coming of colonialism, and at the height of the sugar boom of the 1650s, 12,000 hectares of forest would be cleared in a single year, right? So these are kind of some precious clues to an epochal transition in the relations of power, wealth, and nature that occurred over the course of the long medieval crisis and the epochal shift that commenced after 1450. And this time period, after 1450 until 1750, we find a new era of human relations with the rest of nature, which we call the Age of Capital. And its epicenters were the seats of imperial power and financial might. And it wrapped around the entire ecosystem from the Baltic to Brazil, Scandinavia to Southeast Asia, and accelerated environmental transformation before anything known before. And there were obviously a lot of technological shifts that facilitated this landscape revolution, as well as new techniques, which is we kind of call as repertoire of science, power, and machinery created together that aimed at discovering and appropriating new cheap natures. When the so-called explorers went to find the new world, right? That was a process of and kind of backed by knowledge and the growth of that knowledge to discover and appropriate new lands for colonial powers. And there were new ways at this time of mapping and calculating the world. And probably what was most fundamental at that time was a shift in how things were valued. Okay, so all civilizations throughout human history have laws of value, which is, pattern priorities for what is valuable and what is not. And the decisive shift occurring at this time was precisely around value, where it shifted from land productivity, which early political economist theorists like Malthus, even Smith and so forth, initially had a focus on. So they were concerned about land productivity and thought of value as arising from what land could produce, to then that change to labor productivity under the hegemony of the world market, which was the very basis and the living atmosphere of the capitalist mode of production. So again, which, as I mentioned before, which involved that process of proletarianization, where people became workers who had to sell their body and sell their labor power for money, as as lands and assets were appropriated. But then what, I guess the question is then what difference could this make to our understanding of a biospheric crisis in our century now? But arguably a really big one is what the capitalist scene scholars will tell you. This shift from kind of land to labor productivity as the decisive metric of wealth implied a really novel approach to the relation between human activity and nature. So for the first time, the forces of nature were deployed to advance the productivity of human work, but only some human work, as we mentioned before. Human work within the sphere of commodity production and exchange, which was usually called the economy, and we still do call that, was to be valued. All other activity was devalued and appropriated in service to advancing the labor productivity in this economy, right? So the birth of nature occurred at this point, which was the non-economic sphere of appropriation, which implied and necessitated the birth of society. And both were seen, and this again is a quote from Marx, as dripping with blood and dirt. And the necessary kind of counterpoint to the separation of the producers from the means of production. And when you hear that phrase, which is often spoken about in critical scholarship of the separation of the producers from the means of production, that's basically saying it's describing proletarianization, which I mentioned to you before, more or less, where people who used to own things that they used to make food, to make things they could sell, were separated from those things. So the most maybe basic demonstration of that would be the separation of the guilds. Like there used to be guilds of builders or tailors and so forth. They had access to things that helped them produce stuff, and they were separated from those machines and whatever it might be, and so the producers, they're separated from the things they used to make things, meant that those producers then needed to sell their labor to access money, right? So this separation was a really vital process in not only the birth of capitalism as modern society, but also the understanding of the separation of humanity and nature. So the first accomplishment of this new law of value was to create cheap labor, not only in the European metropole, but especially in the rest of the colonized world. So the number of slaves which disembarked each decade in the Americas, which are mostly to grow sugar, which is modernity's original cash crop, increased a staggering 1,000% between 1560 and 1710. Slave prices still tended to rise, which was a tribute to capitalism's devastation of human nature, but from a base much lower than the wage bill for European proletarians. Because cheap labor and productive labor both required one thing: if profitability was to be advanced and the accumulation of capital was to quicken, which was cheap energy, food, and raw materials. Cheap thermal energy to smelt the metals, process the sugar cane, make glass, beer, bricks, and everything else demanded by the world market. Cheap food to keep the price of labor power from rising, at least rising too fast. And this was a central concern for political economists at that time, where you had political economists such as Ricardo, who would talk about the value of labor in terms of how much you needed to feed them, right? So he'd talk about the household basket of goods, and his concern, as well with others, was to ensure that basket of goods was cheap as possible, because then the consequence is that then you could pay laborers cheaper. If things didn't cost that much to buy, you could justify paying them less, right? So cheap food was really central to keeping the price of labor power low. And then finally, cheap raw materials. So this is like timber for shipbuilding, potash for dyeing textiles, iron for basically everything, to maintain this cycle of expanding commodity production. So the whole of nature at this time is the first time to be put to work in a radically, alienating and dynamic way for capitalism to survive. So this, again, going back to that landscape revolution, really created an unprecedented landscape revolution in human history. And the first condition was the conquest of the Atlantic. Between 1535 and 1680, the capital's world ecology more than doubled in size, conquering some 4 million square kilometers between 1535 and about the late 1600s. And this appropriation of the New World was the fundamental structure of the first modernity. These conquests incorporated not only like this vast expanse of cheap labor, but also the labor power to use it. Even by 1500, Spain alone had colonized more than 2 million square kilometers, which was an area greater than the whole of Europe at that particular time, and more than 25 million indigenous people, many who were then forcibly integrated into systems of work that produced value for the Europe of the center. And these kind of figures of new and cheap and free labor was complemented by this thirst of cheap nature within Europe. So even with the Low Countries of Europe, which is like kind of around Holland, an agricultural revolution allowed 3/4 of those populations of what was called the Low Countries to work outside of agriculture. So once agricultural productivity started to increase, then obviously didn't need as many laborers. So then you could get rid of a lot of the agricultural laborers and expelled them from the countryside. So then they had to go to the big cities and find work, which then started to fuel and provide the labor power for manufacturers and mining and other professions and workplaces at that time. So in Central Europe, a mining and metallurgic revolution started to supply the capital's order with the physical basis for its money, which is silver, as well as manufacturing, such as iron and copper. And forests, which were previously held in common by peasants in that area, were rapidly transformed. And Central European mining kind of reached its apogee in near like the 1500s, early 1500s. And this region produced the lion's share of capitalism's basic like raw materials such as copper, lead, and iron. And new technology started to be used in mining and metallurgic techniques, which allowed for this kind of revolutionary increase in silver production. So production of all metals started soaring by fivefold or greater between this 1450s, started the 1450s and then the mid 1500s. And across Central Europe, the metallurgic capitalist industry started scouring the countryside for fuel, which affected widespread pollution, deforestation, which then grew into the newly conquered regions in the Americas as cheap silver was found, mined, and then cash crop commodities grown for continental Europe. Now, the next kind of major point of our story is in the 1700s. So these processes had continued to go, but by 1700, England had become Europe's breadbasket. Between 1700 and 1750s-ish, England grain exports kind of boomed by 500%, 6 times faster than aggregate exports. By mid-century of the 1700s, the English agriculture started to stagnate. And that was because the nitrogen reserves in the soil had basically been depleted. And so these rapid gains in agricultural productivity started to stall in the mid-1700s. And this is where the concern of a rising population, low food production started to really resonate with political economists at that time. And the problem was that there was a capitalist and world ecological problem. So it's a problem of how humans have mixed their labor with the earth. And this problem with agricultural productivity, which then started to cause runaway food price inflation, a net capita reduction in food consumption, which was both of which were really disastrous, was mainly because of human action on soil, right? It exhausted the soil, and this contributed to even further expansion of agriculture throughout the world to find lands, which were fertile, which could then, further grow food for the European populace. So around this time as well, in the 1700s, outside of this expansion of agricultural, search for agricultural lands, other global transformations then occurred. Um, the great burst of Spanish and Italian expansion produced this kind of exhaustion of Mediterranean forests. Um, for these powers, deforestation weighed heavily on their capacities to supply quality shipbuilding timber, which is fundamental to the commercial and the military struggles of the time. They had to relocate their shipbuilding offshore. So this like relentless geographic expansion of forest products and shipbuilding frontiers was bound up with like a great hunt of commodities. So like, whaling vessels devoured the North Atlantic sources of maritime protein, the transcontinental search for furs in Siberia and North America. These great frontier movements continued across the Atlantic world in the 18th century, which reshaped food, energy, and labor relations. Steadily rising sugar demand, which was the main cash crop at this time, and the exhaustion of a lot of sugar complexes around the world favored successive sugar revolutions in the West Indies. So sugar transformed Barbados, Jamaica, and Saint Domingo into kind of agro-export platforms over the next century, which left a trail of African graves and destroyed landscapes in its wake. The resurgence of Mexican silver production in the 18th century then led to deforestation of already thin Mexican forests. And maybe most significantly, the epoch-making Columbian exchange, as old world diseases, animals, and crops flowed into the Americas, and new world crops like potatoes, maize flowed into the old world. So this also had a huge impact on natures and landscapes. So the genius of capitalism, which, from the global conquest that commenced in 1492, has been to treat the work of nature as a free gift. So from the beginning, Europe's great empire set out to deploy science in its widest sense, mapping the world, collecting and organizing biogeographical knowledge, establishing new administrative technologies to make the whole of nature work on the cheap. These were conquests that made plunder work for capitalism in a way that went beyond brute force in domination. But it's very hard, it's impossible to sustain a civilization just on plunder. Plunder's too episodic, it's too violent, and it's even too costly, and which the Spaniards discovered in the early 16th century as well. And the Spaniards themselves also discovered the great divide of nature and society, and how it could be useful for rendering not only land but labor very cheap. So the Spaniards referred to Peru's indigenous population as naturales. So emphasizing again that not all humans were part of humanity, and the better that they could then deliver cheap nature. Now, more recently, this long history has been somewhat reproduced over the past 4 decades. The Earth is now ringed by over 2,000 satellites, enabling the unprecedented surveillance and mapping of planetary space. The human genome is now mapped. Biopiracy and biotechnology have proceeded. But today is very different from the 1970s for 2 big and closely related reasons. So first, the potential sources of cheap nature are much fewer than before. And this is kind of demonstrated by the non-revolution agricultural biotechnology. For all the kind of claims that biotech will somehow feed the world, there has been no revolution in agricultural productivity. And this kind of growth in agricultural productivity has really slowed since the mid-1980s. And same with energy. So after the opening of oil frontiers in the 1970s, such as in Alaska, the Gulf of Mexico, West Africa, there hasn't been a lot of discovery of major sources of cheap energy since then. And indeed, the world history of energy of the past decade has been marked by the opening of frontiers that are very opposite of those which have historically sustained capitalism. Because there's not really low-cost frontiers anymore, but very high-cost ones, especially like in North America's unconventional oil sectors, which cost a lot of money to extract. And it doesn't seem like even that cheap labor is here to stay much longer. With China was the workshop of the world in the 1990s and 2000s, mostly because of that process of proletarianization was happening in China more recently, where people flowed into the cities from the countryside. But this was a really one-shot deal because now wages are rising in the cities in China quite rapidly. The countryside no longer offers an easy reservoir for cheap labor power. So that workshop of the world is not becoming so cheap anymore. So by today, there's really nowhere to run. Much of what we've seen global capitalism achieve over the past decade has been a shifting of costs. So from one capitalist to another, and especially from capital to the vast majority. And there has been really another vector of cost shifting accelerating in recent years, which is from the present to the future. And this is costs imposed on future generations. And this has kind of looked like, financialization and the polarization of income and wealth, where we have the 1% and the 99%, which have really been predictable results of this cheap nature. And it really will be a struggle to sustain capitalism as it was historically without this cheap nature. So this is kind of the ideas that Capitalocene, the theorizing of Capitalocene brings to the table in thinking about climate change and international relations. And it's something that is really consistent or is used as a heuristic device to understand global warming and climate change through a lot of the critical theories that we've spoken about. So this history from 1450 up until the present day, which is capitalism predicated on cheap nature, cheap energy, and cheap labor, has had really substantial impacts for the changing and remaking of landscapes. And one of the things I really want to emphasize again is you can see how important those ontological frames of viewing the world are to how the world is constructed. So by looking at the world as divided between things, you can see how, I hope, see how that has had really material effects. So I'm going to now move on finally. I think we've gone quite a long time now on this, and I promise the rest of this lecture is considerably shorter because this is now catching up to the current moment of the climate crisis. So again, many of you would have known that we're now in a severe kind of current warming cycle that is at a rate not seen for the past 10,000 or so years. And I'm going to just touch on firstly the kind of the early research that had occurred before and during the Cold War, and how that's changed our own understandings at the moment. I'm going to skip the discussion of individual solutions and recycling politics because I think I've probably maybe exhausted my welcome in this lecture already through that extensive previous discussion. But I think, what I just wanted to highlight just briefly is how research more broadly in the scholarly tradition has considered the climate crisis. And early in the 20th century, there was a prevailing notion that people could alter climates locally. We cut down forests, we can plow virgin fields, but not on a global scale. There definitely was research programs on, the historic ice ages and other climate shifts, but really few considered them to repeat as an immediate threat at all. And hardly really anyone thought that humans could trigger kind of worldwide climate change. There were a few pioneering thinkers, and most famously, you might have heard of the Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius, I think his name is Arrhenius, in the late 1800s. Who had seen the potential global impact of fossil fuels, but their views were typically dismissed by colleagues at the time. And Arrhenius quite famously argued that if quantities of CO2 in the atmosphere were to drop by half the current amount, then the Earth's surface temperature would drop by 4 degrees. But he also found that if the concentration was to double, then it would warm by 4 degrees. And so Arrhenius was one of the first to suggest that human-caused emissions of CO2 from burning fossil fuels could raise the global temperature. But it wasn't really until the 1950s that there started to be more dedicated research into this. And this was because at the time, we started to have more precise measurements of carbon dioxide, which confirmed its steady increase in the atmosphere. There was the first computer models of global climate in the 1960s, with more complex ones coming soon after that. And finally, they started to be able to track that global temperature itself began to rise sharply in the 1970s and 80s, which helped raise the issue's profile among the media and the public, as well as scientists. And also, at this time, really importantly, there was really severe food problems. In the mid 70s, and even maybe a bit before that, in the early 70s, there was some really devastating food crises, which started to demonstrate the linking of the climate and droughts to human survival. So the Sahel and the Horn of Africa had suffered famines of climatic origin in the late 60s and early 70s, and that caused more than 500,000 deaths and huge amounts of migration. But it wasn't really until 1984 and 1985 that news of these of further disasters due to the lack of water reached more kind of Western public opinion. In these years, again, a persistent drought ravaged the Sahel and triggered a major famine that made headlines in the press and on television. So that also started to encourage people to think about human activity and the climate. Now, the emission of greenhouse gases is still quite an obscure topic for governments and especially international relations theorists and practitioners. But after the 1973 oil crisis, petrochemical companies were facing a future where nuclear energy might be the inevitable alternative to hydrocarbons. And they started to wonder if the climate evolution could start altering their business model, especially when economists and even some geologists had forecast that oil and natural gas reserves would be depleted at the beginning of the 21st century. And the largest oil company in the world, Exxon, launched a research project at that time, around the late 70s, on carbon dioxide emissions. And quite interestingly, there's quite a lot of evidence that Exxon and other petroleum companies knew very clearly of the damaging impacts of climate change at this time, as well as their contribution to it, but had engaged in decades since of misinformation and blocking of progress on the issue. So a really early example is that in the late 1980s, NASA quite famously told a US congressional hearing that the planet was already warming, but Exxon remained publicly convinced that the science was still controversial. Then they also then around that time created something called the Global Climate Coalition, which is disbanded in the early 2000s, which operated to question the scientific basis for concern about climate change. And as we will see, that Exxon also prevented or helped to prevent the US from signing the Kyoto Protocol in 1998, and also influenced other countries such as China and India from signing that same treaty. And even in the early 2000s, Exxon itself had spent more than $30 million on think tanks that promoted kind of climate skepticism and denial. And in the 1980s, there was this kind of idea that nature would absorb everything. And there was this blind faith in technology, which would eventually solve this increasingly evident problems of pollution. But then alarming forecasts started to appear that there's not going to be enough resources, there's going to be more water pollution and huge amounts of waste. And it was in the late 80s that a turning point started to occur, where there was this discussion of sustainable development was promoted by the UN. And this started to sow the seeds of the future millennial development goals, which gave way to the current sustainable development goals. And as a part of this thinking, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, was established in 1989 under the United Nations to provide a more scientific view of climate change and its potential and economic impacts. So going a little bit further on this point to highlighting some of the international agreements which have progressed since that time. I want to kind of just speak about these quite briefly to show where international relations practice has been, I guess. And the first one I want to talk about is the Kyoto Protocol. This was negotiated in 1997, but it didn't come into force until about 2005. The idea of Kyoto was originally to reduce the emissions of 6 greenhouse gases in 41 countries plus the European Union to about 5% below 1990 levels between the years of 2008 to 2012. Quite infamously, President George Bush announced the US would not implement the Kyoto Protocol in early 2001, and signing that it might hurt the US economy. And, really, like, up until 2009, global emissions had been soaring by 40%. And this is also because like major countries like India and China weren't a part of the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol was also attempted to have a kind of Mark II or Kyoto Protocol 2, but that also failed in the after 2010s. And the negotiators basically, if the Kyoto Protocol were only able to extend it until 2020, but the remaining participants in the Kyoto talks accounted for just 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And there are a lot of reasons why Kyoto failed quite spectacularly. And one of the ones that I just wanted to focus on is quite relevant to Australia. And, I don't know if you guys had heard much about this, but the Kyoto Protocol had a particular article in it, which was called the Australian Article, which allowed parties who had significant land use changes in 1990 to include those changes as a source of greenhouse gas emissions. And at the time, Australia was the only developed country in which vegetation clearing with its consequent kind of global greenhouse gas emissions occurred to any kind of substantial extent. So this article applied exclusively to Australia. So this basically meant that in 1990, because of including these land clearing in their emissions, it looked like Australia's greenhouse emissions were huge. And actually, Australia's like baseline emissions in 1990 amounted to like 26 tons per year per person, which is the highest per capita emission level in the world. And so that means when you set targets to lower that artificially high level, then you obviously don't have to do much, because if your actual, if what you were actually emitting is some far below that, then you don't, if you just stay in your current course and increase it by a little bit, you're not going to get anywhere near this artificially set target in 1990. So this Australia clause really undermined the environmental progress made by Australia, and totally destroyed Australia's environmental credibility for a long time, and really upset huge number of members of developing countries. So it really hurt the international environmental negotiation forums as well. Now, the next kind of major protocol that came into place was the 2015 Paris Agreement, which was premised on hope of the international society coming together and reversing the trends seen so far and preventing dangerous climate change. And 197 countries pledged to set targets for their own greenhouse gas cuts and to report their pledges and report their progresses, which was signed in December 2015. So the whole backbone of this agreement was a declaration to prevent a global temperature rise of about 2 degrees Celsius. Because many experts considered this 2 degrees to be a critical limit, which if passed would lead to increasing risk of more deadly heat waves, drought storms, and rising global sea levels, and this real point of no return. The Paris Agreement works on this 5-year cycle of increasingly, or supposed to be increasingly ambitious climate action carried out by countries. So since 2020, countries have been submitting their national climate action plans, which are otherwise known as nationally determined contributions. So this kind of communicates the actions that countries will take to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. And each successive national determined contribution is meant to reflect an increasingly higher degree of ambition compared to the previous one. And the first of these reports, which was released in late 2023, warned governments that the world is not on track to meet the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. And the current policies of the Paris signatories could actually result in an increase of 2.7 degrees by 2100. So a lot of scholars, commentators, and others felt that the Paris Agreement was a large failure, and especially after in 2016, when Donald Trump took the United States out of the Paris Agreement, which many thought meant it was dead in the water. Of course, Biden, brought the United States back into it in 2021, but really, the achievement so far of the Paris Agreement, and this is described by the organizers themselves, is mostly isolated to creating new markets in green finance and technology and creating new business opportunities. So it's quite disappointing from the perspective of doing something material to deal with the climate challenge, especially when we start thinking about it through the capital-C framework. Now, COP28 is the next one I wanted to, and last one I wanted to speak about, which is the most recent. COP28 refers to the 28th session of the Conference of Parties, which is, in other terms, the 2023 United Nations Climate Change Conference. COP has been running since the mid-90s and is held every year as an opportunity for signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to discuss and find solutions to climate change. And at each kind of COP event, signatories are able to review and assess the measures they've introduced and discuss global solutions to the climate crisis. And the Paris Agreement was a notable outcome of COP21 in 2015. But COP28 began in quite a bit of controversy. The appointment of Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber as president-designate of COP28 was seen as very controversial. Al Jaber is the UAE Minister for Industry and Advanced Technology, but he's also the chief executive of the UAE's national oil company, ADNOC, which is one of the world's largest oil and gas producers. And even more controversially still was the fact that ADNOC was planning a large-scale expansion of oil and gas operations. So there's a real question of his credibility to lead COP28. And the draft deal that was initially produced at COP28 stopped short of calling on nations to gradually phase out fossil fuels. And there was allegations that oil-rich countries had used their influence to water down the language initially on the need to eliminate fossil fuels, which was seen as the main kind of goal, right? And then after outrage occurred over that draft agreement, discussions on fossil fuels turned into a marathon debate at COP28, which extended the conference for an additional day. And then the final agreement, which was finally adopted a few days later, was the first text to call on countries to transition away from fossil fuels, as well as phase down the use of coal. But there's still a lack of adequate commitments on funding by developed countries to help other states to adapt to the harmful impacts, which is seen as being wholly inadequate and putting a lot of frontline communities and other marginalized groups in jeopardy. So there was real concerns that, again, the COP28, even from understanding the current climate crisis from the Anthropocene as being really inadequate. Now, I think this is probably right at the end of the lecture too, so you've done a really great job sticking with me through this. And we're going to touch on now, well, what's the current state of the climate crisis in 2024? So the annual global carbon budget projects fossil carbon dioxide emissions of 36.8 billion tons in 2023, which was up 1.1% from 2022. There are some reductions of carbon dioxide emissions like in Europe and the US, but overall, it is rising around the world. So scientists are saying that, we're not acting fast enough to prevent this dangerous climate change. And so there's an active question of how long it will be until we cross another threshold of 1.5 degrees of global warming, which might occur much sooner than had previously been expected. And there's a prediction by this organization called the Global Carbon Budget that there's a 50% chance of global warming will exceed 1.5 degrees consistently in about 7 years. And especially as emissions of coal, oil, and gas are all projected to increase. And the levels of technology-based carbon dioxide removal amounts to a tiny proportion of what's actually produced. So another new report from the World Meteorological Organization this year showed that records were once again broken, and in some cases smashed, for greenhouse gas levels, surface temperatures, ocean heat and acidification, sea level rises, Antarctic sea ice cover, and glacial retreat over the last year. This report confirmed that 2023 was the warmest year on record, with the global average near surface temperature at 1.45 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial baseline. It was the warmest 10-year period on record, and on an average day in 2023, nearly 1/3 of the global ocean was gripped by a maritime heat wave, which harmed vital ecosystems and food systems. And Antarctic sea ice extent was by far the lowest on record. The number of people who were acutely food insecure worldwide was more than doubled, from about 150 million people before COVID-19 pandemic to nearly 350 million people in 2023, with weather and climate extremes, being a substantial cause of that as well. And the observed concentrations of the three main greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, reached record levels in 2023 as well, with carbon dioxide itself 50% higher than pre-industrial era, which is trapping heat in the atmosphere. So globally, every month from June to December last year, there's record warm temperatures compared to the previous respective month, with September 2023 particularly noteworthy, which surpassed the previous global record for September by quite a wide margin of around 0.5 degrees. There was extreme weather and climate events which had major socioeconomic impacts on all inhabited continents, such as flooding linked to extreme rainfall from the Mediterranean cyclone Daniel, which affected Greece, Bulgaria, Turkey, Libya, and with particular loss of life in Libya in September. Tropical cyclone Freddie in February and March. This was one of the world's longest lived tropical cyclones, with major impacts on Madagascar, Mozambique, and Malawi. Tropical cyclone Mocha in May was one of the most intense cyclones ever observed in the Bay of Bengal, which triggered 1.7 million displacements across the region. And Hurricane Otis intensified to a maximum Category 5 system in a matter of hours, which was one of the most rapid intensification rates in the satellite era, which hit the Mexican coastal resort of Acapulco in October, and caused economic losses at around $15 billion and killed at least 47 people. It's also extreme heat affecting many parts of the world. Temperatures in Italy reached 48 degrees. Record high temperatures for Tunis, in Morocco, in Algiers, reaching up to 50 degrees. And the Greater Horn of Africa region has been experiencing a long-term drought and then suffered substantial flooding in 2023. Which displaced 1.8 million people across Ethiopia, Burundi, South Sudan, Tanzania, Uganda, Somalia, and Kenya, which is in addition to the 3 million people already displaced internally or across borders by the consecutive seasons of drought. So in response to these developments, one of the things that we also have to think about as international relations scholars is the impact on social cohesion and the kind of liberal normative status quo that we have at present. And really in the last few years, we've seen climate activists who are increasingly concerned about this becoming more militant and more direct in their action. And you can actually see a really great kind of demonstration of this and exploration and investigation in one of the recommended resources, which is the documentary How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which I recommend you have a look at. And we can also see, this kind of radicalism born out in movements such as Extinction Rebellion, as more and more people get really concerned about this climate crisis in the face of the current, I guess, and the historical actors of the world being unable to do anything, it seems, in response. And as the protests and actions by people have become more and more direct and, hitting more economic and critical infrastructure, the response to that has become even more authoritarian and draconian as many states have started to create laws that limit protests and to protect industry. And I just wanted to finish now by highlighting that Australia has been really at the forefront of this movement. In Queensland, for instance, 2019, laws were introduced to make sure protesters who clamped themselves to buildings or other bits of the city could be hit with huge fines and longer jail time. In mid-2022, the New South Wales government introduced laws and penalties which specifically targeted protesters who blocked roads and ports, threatening them with up to 2 years in prison and up to $22,000 in fines. Then Victoria followed soon after, with harsh new measures which targeted environmental protesters at logging sites with up to 12 months jail or $21,000 in fines. In Tasmania, environmental activists now face fines of up to $13,000 or 2 years in prison, while non-governmental organisations that have been found to support members of the community to protest face fines of up to $45,000. The South Australian government then followed, again, introducing harsh new anti-protest measures with bipartisan support after very little debate and no public consultation, and increased punishment for public obstruction 60-fold, from $750 to $50,000 or 3 months in jail, with activists also facing orders to pay for police and other emergency services responding to a protest or action. And many lawyers across the country have argued that these measures, altogether are often unconstitutional, and they're facing a lot of ongoing legal challenges. But I mean, interestingly, I just wanted to highlight too that Australia has had a really long history of disruptive protests to protect the environment. And most significantly is the green bans, which were a form of economically disruptive direct action that saved several historical sites in the 1970s. And most notably, if any of you are familiar with the Rocks in Sydney, this was going to be demolished in the early 70s to make way for office towers. And unionised workers at that time halted any work associated with these developments. And this direct action economically harmed the developers and the investors, and the developments were put to a halt. As labourers withdrew their labour and their communities mobilised to prevent the developments from taking place. And so this protected the environment and other sites such as the Rocks, which is still accessible by the community today. But Australia's response has really followed a lot of other countries, with the United States also implementing a plethora of anti-protest legislation. In the aftermath, especially the Black Lives Matter protests, there's at least 8 states passing laws which increase penalties for blocking traffic, tearing down monuments, and other unlawful behaviour. In Canada, even various documents revealed that police had authority to shoot Indigenous protesters who sought to block pipeline constructions. And in the aftermath of a pipeline and railway protest by Indigenous activists in 2020, the Legislative Assembly of Alberta introduced an act which prohibited direct action in the form of protests, blockades, and any similar activities which interfered with critical infrastructure, including pipelines and mines. So I guess, overall, I wanted to emphasize here that, we're in a real state of flux, of contestation in the liberal global order, where as the climate crisis worsens and as the current institutional and political structures cannot deal with it, direct action and militant activities by citizens are increasing, which then has had a reciprocal effect of basically causing liberal states to become even more illiberal. And we're going to further discuss these, failures of the international relations system to deal with the climate crisis and the role of community organizing in our upcoming workshop. And I appreciate that everyone has stuck with me through this extended discussion. I actually don't even know how long I've been going for, but I guess I'll see at the end. But I know it was quite a lot, but I really hope that I demonstrated to you some of the critical theorizing around the capitalist scene and the Anthropocene, and how these frameworks or these glasses for understanding these crises or issues in international relations can have firstly a really profound material effect on the world, but can also help us more adequately understand or at least understand problems from different perspectives. And like I said, the whole purpose of this isn't to transform you all into critical scholars. Like, my main goal is I want you guys to see different ways of thinking about these issues, which you might otherwise not get from, mainstream international relations. And if this just challenges you to, re-concretize or, back up your own, mainstream IR frameworks, which you utilize, then, I'd be very happy. But also, maybe this might also get you to, think more broadly about what these critical theoretical frameworks are bringing to the international relations scholarship. So remember, again, we have a quiz this week, but there will be an Easter holiday. So just double check the quiz deadline. I think it is a little bit extended to take into account the Good Friday holiday coming up. But I look forward to seeing you all in the workshops coming up, and I hope you all keep well until then. And I'll talk soon.